Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Buenos días. Gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana. My name is Arturo Vargas. I'm the Executive Director of the NALEO Educational Fund. NALEO is the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials. We are a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Our mission is to promote the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. And there is nothing more fundamental to our political process than the decennial census. And so we're here today to talk about, as our presentation is titled, Democracy at Risk, the 2020 Census and Latinos. And let me start off by saying that I have been working on the census my entire career. I started working first on the 1990 census back in 1988. So for 30 years now, I've been closely following every single decennial census for the past 4 censuses. And in fact, for this current census, I have sat on some version of the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committees. I currently sit on the National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Population Groups appointed by the Director of the Census Bureau. I served on 2 previous advisory committees appointed by Secretaries of Commerce of both Republican and Democratic administrations. So I have had a front row seat in observing the Census Bureau's preparations for the 2000, 2010, and 2020 censuses. And I can say without a doubt that of all those censuses, this is the one all of us should be most concerned about in terms of the Census Bureau's ability to carry out its mandate for a full and complete enumeration of the US population. Democracy truly is at risk right now because of what the Department of Commerce has done to undermine the mission of the Census Bureau. So what is the mission of the Census Bureau? Quite simply, it comes from the Constitution. I would assume that people in this room actually are aware of the origins of the census, but as I have been traveling the country and working with community leaders and members of the Latino community and other communities, because everything we do is in coalition, I have learned to appreciate the fact that we need to ensure that Americans understand their history and that the origins of the census comes very much from the origins of this nation. That it's in the Constitution, the orders to carry out a decennial count of the US population, primarily for the purpose of the distribution of political power, of the reapportionment of the US House of Representatives. And remember, it was not always stated in the Constitution that everybody counted equally. When the Constitution was written, slaves, African-American slaves, were considered to be only 3/5 of a person, and Native Americans living on reservations were not counted at all. That was corrected by the 14th Amendment, and today the words of the Constitution are quite clear, that representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to the respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. Doesn't say the whole number of white people, doesn't say the whole number of men, doesn't say a whole number of straight people, doesn't say the whole number of adults, doesn't say the whole number of citizens, nor does it say the whole number of non-citizens. It says the whole number of persons. And so we take the Constitution to its word, that it is the duty of Congress to oversee a census that enumerates every single person who lives in the United States on April 1st, 2020. And for the purposes of the census is the allocation of political power. But it's also used for the protection of civil rights. The only way that we can understand exactly the impact of different policies and practices on our population and disparate impact on our population is by having data, good data, on racial and ethnic populations. Over time now, the Census Bureau data has been used for the allocation of billions of dollars of federal funds to the states throughout the country. Over $700 billion now is allocated to the states that use census data in some formula to determine the amount that each state receives. And it's used to make informed policy decisions. Our organization has in its membership elected and appointed officials at all levels of government: local government, state government, county government, federal government, and each of our members sits to make decisions for the benefit of their communities. And every one of their decisions uses data to make sure that they are making the right decisions, that they're making the right decisions in terms of allocation of resources, of which streets need to be paved, of which schools need to be built, of which clinics need to be opened because of where the population is moving and changing. Bad data means bad decisions. Bad data hurts everybody. It is in the interest of every single American that the Census Bureau conduct a full and complete enumeration. In terms of the impact on political representation, this is a map of the United States and the distribution of the U.S. House of Representatives following the 1950 census. You see already California had 30 congressional seats on par with Pennsylvania, second only to the state of New York, the Northeast still having the bulk of the population and the bulk of political power in this country. But as the population has shifted and grown in different parts of the nation, so has political representation. The red and pink states are the states that after the 2010 census lost one or more members of Congress, and the blue states were the winners. Well, the blue states have something in common. After the 2010 census, they all gained in congressional representation, and they all gained over that decade in their Latino population. So very much at the heart of a full enumeration is to make sure that we have fair allocation of political power based on shifts in demography in this nation. You see California was at 53 members of Congress by the end of the 2000 census in 2010. It didn't change, but now Florida, with its large Latino population, equals in the number of representatives with the state of New York. And the state with the second largest congressional delegation is Texas. The only state not in the Midwest or Northeast that lost congressional representation after the 2010 census was Louisiana, the only southern state to lose population. And we know that prior to the 2010 census, Louisiana experienced one of the worst natural disasters in this country with Hurricane Katrina. And there was a massive population displacement from Louisiana to other states, from Louisiana to Texas, which in part explains the increase in representation for Texas and the decrease in representation for Louisiana. Our nation already has experienced several hurricanes that have resulted in demographic displacement. Hurricanes Irma, Harvey, and Maria have affected millions of Americans, and there's been massive displacement from the island of Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans leaving the mainland and settling in Florida and other states. All of these populations will need to be fully counted, including those on the island of Puerto Rico. And it should not be lost on us that this is still 2018. We're still 2 years away from the actual enumeration. We're still 2 hurricane seasons away from the next census. So the Census Bureau needs to be prepared for any eventuality that may occur, whether it be a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. Now, the reason that, in terms of allocation of resources, this shows the kinds of programs that use census data to distribute funds to the states. And it runs the gamut of what government does to serve the American people, the American people's taxes. So it shouldn't be lost on us. Today is April 17th. Today is the day all of us were supposed to submit our tax forms and pay our fair share of our taxes. Well, those taxes are supposed to come back to the public according to the need of the communities based on population data. And these are the range of programs that use those numbers from the census. They're programs that serve people's health, like Medicaid, Medicare, basic infrastructure of the United States, like highway planning and construction, education programs like Title I grants to local education agencies, even the National School Lunch Program. All of these programs use census data to determine how much money comes back to each state. Bad data means a misallocation of those resources. And the irony is that many of these programs are designed to help the most vulnerable communities in the United States. Poor people, children, people who are homeless. Those very same people who are undercounted are designed to benefit from these programs many times. And the fact that they are undercounted means that the communities where they live are actually getting less resources to meet the very same needs that these programs are designed to meet. We at NALEO have a particular concern about the historic undercount of the Latino community. The Census Bureau has never accurately counted the US population. It has improved the count over the decades. And in fact, the 2010 census is reported to be the most accurate total count of the US population that the Census Bureau has carried out. The Census Bureau will report that it was the best net count of the population. But as you listen to the Census Bureau, be very careful in understanding the terms that it uses. When the Census Bureau says it was the best net count of the population, it means that once it took into account the people it missed and the people it counted more than once, that the net resulted in a pretty good count of the total number of people. Well, that's fine, but that's not showing the true picture of an enumeration, because there is a differential undercount that has been consistent and persistent in this country. A differential undercount where certain populations are counted less well than other populations. People will ask, well, who gets counted more than once? Well, if you have more than one house, because this is an enumeration of households, people with more than one residence are more likely to be counted more than once, because they'll get census forms at each residence. College students are another example of a population that is often overcounted. College students may be counted by their parents at their homes, and they may be counted at their college, at their dormitories or their residences when they're away to college. They get counted more than once. And then there are populations that are not counted well at all. Poor people, renters, people whose first language is not English, children in particular. We had a great expectation at NALEO that finally this would be the census that got at one of the Achilles heels at the Census Bureau. That one of the reasons why the Census Bureau has never actually fully counted the Latino population, because it has an inability to fully count our children. In the 2010 census, demographer William O'Hare, who serves today as a consultant to the Census Bureau and is the foremost expert on data on children, did a demographic analysis of the 2010 census numbers. He studied those numbers against vital statistics, births and deaths and actual migrations. And when he was done with this analysis, he discovered that the 2010 census was missing 1 million children ages 0 to 4. 40% of those children being Latino children. There cannot be an accurate count of the Latino population if Latino children are disproportionately undercounted. Our population of Latino children suffered a 7.1% undercount rate compared to a 4.3% undercount of non-Latino children. So we had been pressuring the Census Bureau over the past 6 years that as it planned 2020, that it do so with the lens of how it was going to ensure that every single child got counted. And again, we had high hopes that this would be a census that finally got to the undercount of very young children and corrected that fault in the enumeration. But now we have even greater challenges that put our democracy at risk. As I said, I sit on the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee, and I have been studying the Census Bureau's plans for the 2020 census. And several years ago, there was actually great reason for optimism about the Bureau's plans to improve the enumeration, to use technology, to be smart, and to be efficient in terms of counting the US population. Now, much of this innovation was driven by a congressional mandate that the Census Bureau was to conduct the 2020 census without spending a penny more than it spent in 2010 and 2010 dollars. That meant that the Census Bureau had to design a census that would save $5 billion over what it would cost to do 2020 if it used the same methodology that it used in 2010. And so the Bureau had proposed a number of changes in order to save that money. But there have been several decisions made above the Census Bureau's level, at the Department of Commerce level, at the Office of Management and Budget level, that has resulted now in the Census Bureau being forced to implement a census it has not planned for. And that is one of the greatest risks to the census. That here we are, less than 2 years out from the decennial census, and the experts, the career staff at the Census Bureau that had devoted over 10 years to planning 2020 are now being forced to plan a census it didn't plan, didn't expect to carry out, and to this day doesn't even have the answers of how it's going to actually pull off 2020. Some of the changes that the Bureau had planned for will continue. It had planned on this being a primarily online census. But even as the Bureau has been studying its plans, it continually has reduced the number of households it thinks will actually go online and answer the census using the internet. At one point, it thought that as many as 55% of the US population would answer the census using online methods, either laptops, tablets, smartphones. It's now down to 42%. We know that there is a digital divide in this country, and many of us who understand the challenges that poor and rural communities face in having access to broadband and Wi-Fi, how this places them at a disadvantage to being counted in an online census, that challenge will persist. The Census Bureau had been planning to use administrative records, administrative data, to fill in the blanks for census forms that are not returned or returned incomplete. The Census Bureau had been studying which administrative records would make sense to use, which records are accurate enough and complete enough in order to be reliable enough, in order to ensure that we have an accurate count of the US population. Well, now the Census Bureau is being forced by changes in the questionnaire to go beyond its original plans of using administrative records. In order to save money, the Bureau had planned to reduce its workforce. And if it uses technology, well, that would make sense, that you would need less bodies, less boots on the ground if you're going to be smart about using technology. But one of the fears that we have is that if you have a smaller workforce, then you're going to have greater challenges of having the diversity of your workforce to actually send enumerators out into the communities that are most at risk of not being counted, enumerators that have the cultural and linguistic competencies to be trusted in those communities and encourage those communities to fill out their census forms. And the Census Bureau, for the past decade, have been planning to completely redesign the way it asked each of us to identify ourselves by our race and ethnicity. And this is something that the Bureau now, in my opinion, is sweeping under the rug because of what has happened in terms of some key decisions that were made. But I think we need to understand exactly what has happened in the Census Bureau's plans to redesign the questions on race and ethnicity. In the 2010 census, the Census Bureau embedded an experiment called the alternative question, the AQE. And it was an experiment of 500,000 questionnaires to get at how to better ask people to report their race and ethnicity, because using the current format that the Bureau used, which was a 2-question format, was confusing and resulted in inaccurate data, especially on Latinos. The Census Bureau experts have recommended a new format that instead of having 2 separate questions, that they have a combined question that asked individuals what their race or ethnicity was. And this is an example of what the Bureau had been planning to implement, had recommended to be implemented for the 2020 census. In fact, this was a questionnaire, the question that was supposed to be on the test dress rehearsal that's happening right now in Providence County. But at the last minute, the Bureau was stopped from doing this. The reason the Bureau wanted to do a combined question is that years of research and millions of dollars spent on research found that there was a significant decline in non-responses, and that most people found themselves in a combined question. In a 2-question format, about 20 million or more people did not find themselves and ended up marking a box called some other race, a category that OMB tells us doesn't exist. it achieved better reporting by Latino identification by the respondents. Latinos found themselves in the combined question. In fact, the Bureau was going to offer Latinos the opportunity to mark more than one national origin if they came from families that were blended from different national origin groups, Mexican and Salvadoran, or Dominican and Puerto Rican. For the first time was the plan. A combined question actually did not result in any loss of data of Latinos who were able to report that they were both Latino and what their racial category was, if it was white or African American or Asian. So it collected data on Afro-Latinos. This combined question was not allowed to go forward by the Office of Management and Budget. The Census Bureau had submitted this recommendation back in 2017. The federal government had developed a federal working group of agencies across the federal government to study the Census Bureau's recommendations. And we know the recommendations to OMB were that it should revise the standards on the collection of federal data on race and ethnicity that were last revised in 1997, that it should revise them based on the years of research and the millions of dollars spent on testing in order to collect better data. But we learned early this year that OMB had decided not to revise the standards without even a mention why. Without even a mention why, years of research, millions of dollars spent on how to better get information and more accurate data was thrown out the window. So the Census Bureau now has been forced to revert to a two-question format to collect information on race and ethnicity. This is the question that was submitted by the Census Bureau to Congress a couple of weeks ago. The deadline for submitting actual questions to Congress was March 31st, 2018. This is not the question that's being tested right now in Providence County, Rhode Island. And this is an example of why these changes being made at the level of the Department of Commerce that is forcing the Bureau to make changes it did not plan for is resulting in chaos and is resulting in a waste of money and a waste of time in preparing for Census 2020. Right now, the Census Bureau is testing a questionnaire that for the Hispanic origin question has instructions that says mark one or more boxes, meaning that a Latino could look at this question saying, is this person of Hispanic or Latino origin? No, not Hispanic or Latino origin, or yes, Mexican, yes, Puerto Rican, yes, Cuban, or yes, other Hispanic, and you could write in what the other Hispanic background was. By saying that the instructions mark one or more box, that a Latino who was both Mexican and Salvadoran or Dominican and Puerto Rican could actually fully identify his or herself and his or her origins. But this was not the question that got submitted to Congress, because over the past few months, the Census Bureau has been scrambling to try to fully understand the consequences of OMB's decision not to revise the standards on race and ethnicity. And now the Census Bureau is telling us that even though it had originally planned to have a two-part question that allowed multiple responses on the Hispanic origin question, it no longer will permit that. It will only allow a single response to the Hispanic origin question, even though the data show that there's a better way to ask the question and collect more accurate and complete data, even though that's what the research shows. But years of research have been thrown out the window. There will be a different race question that was tested in the 2015 National Content Test and is being tested in Providence County, Rhode Island. And what's different about this for all Americans is that it offers everybody the opportunity to identify a particular subgroup in each racial category. So if you identify as white, you can write in your ancestry that you identify with, whether it's Irish or German or English. Same thing if you're Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native. There are a number of checkoff boxes for particular Asian national origin groups, and there continues to be a some other race category. The problem with this two-question format is that Latinos will first, not be allowed to identify themselves fully on the Hispanic origin question. And second, when they are forced to identify themselves racially as well, they will continue to experience this confusion of, I just told you what I am. I told you I'm Mexican. And now the Bureau will say, yes, but that's your ethnicity, now tell me your race. And as a result, there will be a large number of Latinos who will mark the some other race box, a category that OMB says doesn't exist, and a category that when it comes time to come up with reporting data, in some cases, the Census Bureau will have to impute the data for us. They'll have to guess using algorithms what a person's actual race is if they mark some other race. This is imprecise data. This is inaccurate data. Even though research shows how to collect better data, the research was thrown out the window. So when the Bureau talks about what the next questions are going to look like, be sure that we understand that the Bureau had planned something very different. The last time we had a conversation with the Bureau about this two-question format, it told us it would be very likely that the nation's second largest racial group after 2020 will be the people who say they are some other race. That's the consequences of not using research. Well, we thought as we were approaching 2020 and following closely what was happening, that the greatest risks to the census was Congress's failure to do its job and to provide the resources to the Census Bureau to carry out 2020. And in the past 3 fiscal years, Congress has failed to fully appropriate resources so that the Bureau could ramp up, could do the final testing and tweaking to its plans to make sure that things would work in 2020. Well, the Bureau has been underfunded in fiscal years 2016, 17, and 2018. Even the recent budget agreement, which provided more money for the Bureau to help put it back on track, is not sufficient for the Bureau to catch up. And the President's FY 2019 budget request is also insufficient to make sure that the Census Bureau is on track for 2020. While the President's budget calls for $3.8 billion, we believe that the Bureau needs $4.7 billion just to catch up and to try to make up for the loss of time and planning that resulted from inadequate funding. And there have been consequences to the inadequate funding. The Census Bureau has had to cancel test after test after test because it didn't have the money to carry these tests out to make sure that its plans for 2020 would actually work. You know, one of the tests that it had planned for 2017 was a test in Puerto Rico. This was before the hurricane. It would have been very informative to see what an actual census would look like in an all Spanish language environment, to see how we could better count Latinos in certain pockets of this country that have similar circumstances like we see in the island of Puerto Rico, but we won't know that because the test got canceled. Tests were also canceled on Native American reservations. In the years ending in 8, like 2018, the Bureau always holds a dress rehearsal, a dry run of the actual census it expects to carry out in the years ending in 0. And the Bureau had a plan to do 3 dress rehearsal sites for 2018. Pierce County, Washington, a number of counties in West Virginia, and in Providence County, Rhode Island. It has canceled the first 2. And it is only right now carrying out a test census, the final test census in Providence County, Rhode Island, using a questionnaire that it has no intention to use now in 2020. And so we're very concerned about what's going to happen with the results of this end-to-end test that is imprecise and is imperfect in many respects because the Census Bureau is being forced to change its plans at the last minute by decisions being made at the Department of Commerce. It's testing race and Hispanic origin questions it didn't plan to use because it planned to use a combined question. And even the 2-part question it is using is not the questions it will use in 2020. It also has changed the enumeration approach in rural areas, and those members of Congress who represent rural communities need to pay attention here about what's going to happen in the counting of the populations and their constituents. Originally, the Bureau had anticipated doing something called update enumerate, which means it would hire enumerators to go out into rural communities, update an address, and enumerate the household there on the spot. But because of lack of funding, the Bureau has changed its plans and will implement something called update leave. Update leaves means enumerators will be hired to enumerate, to update an address, and then to leave behind the census forms, hoping people will fill them out. So rather than enumerating people on the spot, being efficient, making sure you have an accurate count, we now are going to be leaving behind materials with the hope that these rural households will fill out their census forms on their own. And there's been a massive delay in the implementation of the infrastructure for the actual census itself. The delay in opening of regional offices and a delay in opening local census area offices as well. There are also other issues that the Bureau is dealing with. Again, not by its design. These are not the plans that the Bureau had been anticipating. These are not the circumstances the Bureau had been planning for, to be without a permanent director. John Thompson, who was the previous director, resigned last June 30th. He had been willing to sign up for another term, but his services were no longer desired by the administration. We believe that the Census Bureau needs a leader who is qualified to run an operation on the scale of a decennial census and is an expert and is a scientist and is qualified in the field of demographics and statistics. Somebody who's nonpartisan and qualified. There have been exemplary directors of the Census Bureau already who have led the agency during very difficult times in carrying out the decennial census. Now's the time that the Census Bureau needs somebody of that kind of profile. This is one of the many reasons why the GAO has already characterized the 2020 census as a high-risk federal activity. Now, to be fair, the GAO has always categorized a decennial census as a high-risk federal activity because it's so massive, because it requires so much moving parts that it's always at risk. But the difference is that the GAO put it at risk much earlier in the decennial cycle because of the changes the Bureau had planned to do and because of the inadequate funding that the Bureau had been receiving. And now as we see all these last-minute changes being imposed upon the Census Bureau by the Secretary of Commerce and the department, that the Bureau's ability to carry this out is even in greater question. The fact that the Census Bureau had been anticipating using the internet as the primary response mode also introduces the challenge that the Bureau will have about convincing all Americans that filling out their census forms online will be safe and confidential. You know, many of us conduct much of our lives online, but we're very worried about what happens with our data when it gets shared, and you know, who has access to it, and how's it being used, and who's analyzing the data that we use on social media, who's analyzing data we're going to submit to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has a great challenge to make sure it has the right systems in place to conduct this online census, and also the capacity to explain the challenges and explain the process to the American public and ensure that they are trustful of participating online. And without sufficient resources, the Bureau may not have that capacity. The administration also made another decision earlier this year that seemed to fly under the radar, that only US citizens could be hired to be census workers. Now, census jobs are federal jobs, and federal jobs require US citizenship. But the Census Bureau also needs to have the skills needed to count all Americans. And in some communities, the Census Bureau needs individuals to hire that have the linguistic and cultural skills to count particular populations, which is why in every single previous census that I've worked on, there has always been the hiring of non-citizens who are authorized to work for those particular instances and communities where their skills are needed, and US citizens were not available to be hired with those skill set. in 2010, more than 3,000 non-US citizens were hired as enumerators. That was actually a very low number because in 2010 we had a very high unemployment rate, and the Bureau was able to hire many US citizens with those linguistic skills. Well, going into 2020, we have a very low unemployment rate, and it'll even be more difficult for the Bureau to hire only US citizens with the appropriate skill sets that it needs to count hard-to-count communities. The administration is simply tying yet another hand behind the Bureau's back in order to carry this out. But the elephant in the room, obviously, is the Department of Commerce's decision on March 26 to add yet another question to the census form, to ask a citizenship question. This is a decision made on March 26 by the Secretary of Commerce that came as a result of a request by the Department of Justice in a letter dated December 12, 2017, asking for a citizenship question to be asked on the decennial question. The Census Department of Justice's rationale was saying that it needed census block data, that it needed decennial data on citizenship in order to enforce the Voting Rights Act of minorities. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I've yet to see this Department of Justice act in any way to enforce the voting rights of Latinos or African Americans. The Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965. Since 1960, the Census Bureau has been producing citizenship data based on sample surveys, either the long form that it employed in the 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000 censuses, or the American Community Survey that came into effect beginning in 2005. Throughout the whole life of the Voting Rights Act, the citizenship data that has been used by the Department of Justice, by civil rights litigators, by voting rights litigators, were from sample surveys collected by the Census Bureau. And at no time has any federal court or any civil rights advocate or litigator said that data were insufficient, because they're not. So the rationale behind the question is specious. Now, the Secretary of Commerce said that he needed to take into account this request by the Census Bureau of Department of Justice, and that he would conduct his own study about what the impact of the census would be. And I encourage everybody to read the Secretary of Commerce's 8-page memorandum giving the reasons why he has directed the Census Bureau to add the citizenship question. He goes on and on and on to talk about how he talked to all these experts about what the impact would be. All the experts told him, don't do it. All the experts told him, this is going to result in less accurate data if you add the citizenship question. First, because it is untested in a decennial environment. Second, in this political environment, we know what the impact would be. Read the Washington Post today, and you'll see what's happening here in Maryland, here in the district, about people being fearful already because of this question that's being asked. On March 13th, the Secretary of Commerce called me, and he asked me what I thought about adding a citizenship question. Well, first, I gave him the advice that I would give the Census Bureau. Don't do it, because this is going to increase the cost of the census. Because if you depress response rates, you drive up the cost of conducting the census. And then I shared with him what I have been hearing in my travels around the country from community members, from community leaders who were very reluctant to be the trusted messengers and encourage people to fill out their census forms if there was a citizenship question, because they weren't sure what the motivations of adding this question are in 2020. In his memorandum, he refers to having made these calls to 24 individuals. 24 people he consulted. The Census Bureau spends years and years and years doing research on how to ask questions. And here the Secretary of Commerce is listening to 24 phone calls. I was one of them. And then he says that nobody was able to prove to him that the citizenship question would actually result in lower response rates. Well, it's not my job to conduct tests of the citizenship question. The federal government has an agency that does research on how to ask questions, cognitive research, focus groups, polling, surveys. It's called the Census Bureau. And the Secretary of Commerce dismissed the advice of experts and agreed to add this questionnaire with no testing and oblivious to what the scientific community had been saying. Now, I have often been wanting to give the benefit of the doubt about motivations for these last-minute changes that are hurting one of the most sacred conducts of our democracy, the census. But when the re-election campaign for the president and the vice president used this issue as a fundraising gimmick, one can only think what the true motivations are for trying to sabotage the 2020 census. We know this request is untimely. It's coming at the last minute. The Census Bureau is scrambling to figure out how it's going to pull this off at the last minute. Oh, and by the way, if you read the Secretary of Commerce's memorandum, he says that in order to have the least impact on the census, he's directing the Census Bureau to make the citizenship question the last question on the form. What evidence does he have that it being last makes any difference than it being first? The Census Bureau tests the order of questions all the time. And here, the Secretary of Commerce, with no evidence whatsoever, has decided the question should be last because I think, this is his words, it will have the least impact by being the last question on the form, with no evidence whatsoever of what the order of the questions has on response rates. Every single percentage point of people that the Bureau hopes will respond, of households that don't respond, it's going to add $55 million to the cost of the census. And we know what the impact will be on the Latino community. Read the paper. Look at what's happening right now in Providence County, Rhode Island. This dress rehearsal, this end-to-end test that the Bureau is doing, has a questionnaire that doesn't have the citizenship question on it because there was no time to add it on, because it was so last minute. And already, we're seeing individuals in Providence refusing to participate simply because they think there may be a citizenship question on it. The work of the Census Bureau is being sabotaged and undermined by the Department of Commerce, which is why there has been bipartisan, broad, widespread opposition to the citizenship question. Democratic and Republican mayors, 6 former directors of the Census Bureau, appointed by both Democrats and Republican administrations, 2 previous Commerce secretaries, a Republican and a Democrat, Penny Pitzker and Carlos Gutierrez, have opposed the addition of the citizenship question because they know what the impact will be. And scientific organizations from the American Sociological Association to scientists and economists have all come out asking the Census Secretary of Commerce to reconsider his decision. We need to assure people that all data collected by the Census Bureau is safe and confidential, it's kept confidential, and we're gonna be at even more challenged to make sure that people trust that the data they submit in this census is kept confidential. So we need assurances from the federal government that Title 13 would continue to be the supreme law that would govern this. We're not through fighting this. At NALEO, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the Census Bureau carries out a full, fair, and accurate census, and we're going to continue to oppose the addition of this citizenship question because of what it does to undermine the Census Bureau's job. We know that the Secretary of Commerce still needs to justify adding this new topic. Already now there have been 4 lawsuits filed. I understand there's a 4th one being filed today opposing the addition of this question. The state of California filed the first lawsuit the very same day that the Secretary of Commerce issued his decision. It was followed by 2 more lawsuits, including one by New York that led a coalition of other states. And there's a fourth lawsuit being filed today by a number of civil rights leaders and organizations. Congress needs to step up and needs to hold oversight hearings. It needs to hold accountable the Department of Commerce for the decisions it's making to undermine the Census Bureau. And we need to make sure that the public understands what's at risk here. So the fight has just begun. We will continue to work hard at NALEO to make sure that we carry out a campaign that ensures that our community participates, but we're going to first make sure that we do everything we can to oppose and remove the citizenship question. One of the things that I'm very happy to announce today is that we will be conducting our own assessment of the end-to-end test in Providence County, Rhode Island. Because we know that we can't actually trust the Census Bureau to tell us the truth, because they're only carrying out the orders being passed on high from the Department of Commerce. And they're trying to put the best face on a very bleak picture. So we will be conducting our own assessment of how the end-to-end test actually is happening and being carried out in Providence County, Rhode Island. We will be partnering with Brown University, with Professor Kevin Escudero, who's an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies, to conduct a survey of residents of Providence County to try to learn how they experienced participating in the end-to-end test, how they learned about the census, how they responded. Did they respond online, by phone, by an enumerator, or did they not respond at all, and why? And we're going to use that information to inform the American public and Congress about the true challenges the Census Bureau is facing. And we're going to use that information to also inform our own campaign to make sure that we can ensure all Latinos are counted in 2020. We will be carrying out what I hope will be an even larger version of what we did in 2010. In 2010, NALEO Educational Fund, with its sister organizations, with the help of Spanish language media, of Univision and Telemundo, carried out the most extensive, comprehensive public education campaign that was independently funded to encourage Latinos to participate in that census. We expect to replicate that on a grander scale in 2020, because participation in the 2020 census is going to face unprecedented challenges by the makings of this administration. And we will not let this administration scare our community away from being counted. We will not allow the 2020 census to fail through incompetency and through partisan motivations. We will do everything we can as defenders of democracy to uphold the Constitution and to ensure that all persons are counted as required by our Constitution. We have less than 2 years to go in the timeline. We're in the home stretch. So this now has become a call to arms for the Latino community and all sectors of our community and our sister organizations and those that we work in the coalition to ensure that everybody gets counted in 2020. I'd be happy to take a few questions. Yes, sir.
Question. Obviously, the lawsuits are good. Wait for the microphone. Oh, sure. Hi, Senator Dew with Wells Fargo. The lawsuits are definitely a good start, but obviously it's going to be a sort of a political fight with Congress. If the House or Senate changes to Democrats in 2018, what's your plan to engage Congress maybe on must-pass spending bills to make sure that the Census Bureau is fully funded? Some of the policy reforms you mentioned are put forth.
You know, an inaccurate census harms everybody, Democrat or Republicans. And so the Republicans who are in charge of the House and Senate right now should study hard what the implications of this last-minute census design that the Bureau did not plan for is going to have on the impact on their states. They should be very fearful in the South about the undercount that is coming if nothing changes. The undercount that will come to Alabama and to the Carolinas and to Georgia and to Florida and to Texas because of the last-minute addition of the citizenship question, plus all the other last-minute changes the Department of Commerce is forcing on the Bureau. And the Bureau is scrambling to figure out how it's going to pull this off in the months left before 2020. So an undercount harms everybody, red or blue. Now, if Congress changes in 2018 and there's another Congress in 2019, we will continue to press that Congress as well to ensure its leadership role, because ultimately the responsibility for the census is entrusted with the Congress. And the Congress is the one that funds an agency to carry it out.
Hey,
Fernando?
Arturo, how are you? I may ask you also to, you can respond in Spanish so we can record it. But I mean, question in English first, and if you can do it in both languages, would be great. You say that there was an undercount of 400,000 young Latinos in 2010.
Children.
Children. Have you done an estimate of what the undercount could be in 2020, or is that too adventurous to come up with a figure?
It's too early to know exactly how bad it's going to get in 2020 if changes aren't made. But based on everything we're seeing and the undermining of the Census Bureau's plans and the lack of capacity, I think this country is at great risk of, for the first time, having a worse census than it did previously. And that would be unprecedented.
Do you do it in Spanish?
Hazme la pregunta en español.
¿Qué tan bajo, qué tan grave podría ser el conteo menor de personas en el censo 2020?
Pues aún no sabemos exactamente cuántos no van a ser contados en el año 2020, porque no sabemos exactamente si el Departamento del Censo va a tener la capacidad para levantar ese censo. Pero si el Departamento del Censo sigue con los planes que tiene que implementar hoy día, estamos en un momento donde quizás por la primera vez podamos tener un peor conteo en este censo que viene que el último censo que tuvimos.
And another question to follow up on the lawsuits, what do you expect of the result? I mean, of these lawsuits started by California and New York. I don't know. I don't remember how many states had joined by now.
Right. Well, we're hoping that federal courts, this is one of the things where, we appreciate so much the fact that we have 3 branches of government, and that many times already the judiciary has come to the salvation of our democracy and to our values in this country. And we're hoping that the judiciary, once again, will be able to step in and to ensure that the Constitution is upheld and that all persons are counted. And I'm hoping that these states will be able to demonstrate the harm that will come to them by these last-minute, untested plans that are being forced upon the Census Bureau.
Sorry, one last question. That Census told me about a week ago that they begin to print their forms next year. So if these cases go through the courts, is there a possibility on what is the latest that this could have an actual impact on the printed forms?
Well, there is a deadline, April 1st, 2020, and there are many deadlines leading up to it. And if the forms start to be printed, but if a federal court decides that the forms need to be redone, I don't think we can put a price on democracy of what it actually costs to ensure that everybody gets counted in this country. If you read the Secretary of Commerce's memo, he argues that there will be minimal expenses needed to redesign the questionnaire and to print these. What if the expenses are minimal? I take him to his word. And if we end up having to change the questionnaire in 2019 because federal courts, the litigation prevails, then so be it.
Hi, good morning. I'm Luis Alonso with the AP. Thank you for this. I would like to ask, like an hypothetical question, if the administration gets its way and the citizenship question remains in the questionnaire, what would be the call for NALEO? I've heard some voices from within the community talking about boycotting the questionnaire, or would be a call maybe more focused on skipping this specific question. Could you please talk a little bit about the next?
First and foremost, our mission at NALEO is to make sure that this citizenship question does not go forward, that the Census Bureau is able to implement the plans it originally had designed to carry out a high-tech, efficient 2020 census. So that's first and foremost what we're going to focus on. If we're not successful, then we will look at what we need to do to ensure everybody in our community gets counted. Participating in the census is mandatory by law. And so we want to ensure that everybody complies with the law at all levels of society. And we want to make sure that everybody participates, and we're going to do all that we can to ensure all Latinos participate. We will not support a boycott of the census.
Hi, Arturo. Kenneth Romero from National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. I just want to commend you, first of all, for your leadership in this vital issue for our community. We're very concerned also that the undercounting is going to have an impact on Hispanic businesses. As you know, in the last 10 years, there has been a boom in Hispanic businesses with over 3.3 million entrepreneurs, particularly driven by Latina entrepreneurs, contributing close to $500 billion to the U.S. economy. The issue is that for any of these businesses to grow or for new businesses to flourish, you need to have access to capital. And so when you apply for a business loan, you need to provide a study on the market, right, based on census data. So this could be a crucial factor in getting and having access to that capital. Your thoughts on that?
Well, this is, I think you have demonstrated why economists are opposed to anything that's going to undermine being able to have a fair and accurate and complete census. Because inaccurate census data hurts everybody. It doesn't matter what your party affiliation, because everybody is hurt when we have a bad economy. And bad data is going to hurt our economy. Yes.
Hi, Jessica from JMC Strategy Group. You mentioned how rural areas like Alabama and other states would be heavily impacted by these changes to the census. How do you think it's most effective to really have people understand the impact that could have when they are very receptive to the administration and the White House saying that this citizenship question is necessary?
Well, I think congressional leaders need to not listen to rhetoric, but need to read the facts. And they need to listen to experts. They need to listen to researchers, and they need to listen to people who actually have carried out censuses and understand what a real accurate census requires. And they need to understand what the impact will be, for example, on the changes from update enumerate to update leave on their rural constituents. They need to understand what the impact of changing the questionnaire at the last minute will have on rural communities. Many of these southern states have increased in their Latino populations. A Latino undercount will not just happen in Florida, Texas, and California. It will happen across the country and would affect everybody, hurting everybody, but not having a full count. You cannot have a successful census if you don't count the nation's second largest population group. Latinos are 18% of the population. If you undercount Latinos, you have a failed census.
Hello, Arturo. Guillermo Mena from National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators as well. On changing the topic a bit, on the issue of mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, at least two states, New York and Maryland, have been forced to enact laws to try to overcome the fact that the census counts inmates where the jail or correctional facility is located. And that counts as well for issues of redistricting. And at least those two states and some others to a lesser degree like California have enacted laws that at least for their state representatives and state legislators and others, those inmates should be counted where they came from in their permanent address and not where the correctional facility is located. Do you know if the census has addressed this? Do they ever plan to change the way that inmates are counted? Do they realize the impact that this massive move of primarily minority populations because of the mass incarceration issue has on the power of rural communities where most correctional facilities are located?
Last year, the Census Bureau issued its residency rules for the 2020 census, and it included the rules by which it would enumerate individuals who are incarcerated. Now, my understanding is that the Bureau has decided that it will not change the way it enumerated incarcerated individuals from 2010. That for purposes of reapportioning, the reapportionment count, that incarcerated populations would be counted where those populations are incarcerated. However, the Census Bureau has indicated that it will be providing a tool to states to be able to reassign incarcerated populations for purposes of redistricting. Now, whether or not the Bureau is going to go forward with that, I think that's a good question for the Census Bureau.
And will that count towards redistricting congressional districts as well?
At the redistricting level, yes, because states have the opportunity to use what data they consider to be the most important. Now, obviously, the census data will be considered to be the most accurate and complete data, that if a state doesn't use them, it would have to really justify why it's using a different data set. So in all likelihood, it's the census data that will be used for redistricting. States like Maryland and New York and others do plan to redistribute incarcerated populations so that it more accurately reflects where people will be living for the next 10 years and that political power gets apportioned appropriately. But that's a good question for the Census Bureau about the tool that it has designed to give states the opportunity to actually redistribute its incarcerated populations.
Hi, Arturo. Jose Alfaro, Planned Parenthood Federation of America. We currently have organizers in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, and we're getting ready to expand into 12 other states. How do you suggest that our organizers talk about this work on the ground?
How we talk about this is really important. And I'm not so sure yet what the right messages or messengers are going to be, which is why we will be conducting at the Naleo Educational Fund, along with other organizations, our own message research, focus groups and polling so that we hear from our community how they understand the census and how can we explain to them the importance of being counted and overcoming rational fears that they may have of providing data to the federal government. So one of the things that we want to do is once we complete that research later this year is to share it with other organizations so that they use the best messages and strategies and tactics possible to educate our community so that they actually want to participate in the census. It's going to be a heavy lift, but I'm not going to rely on the Census Bureau's research alone in order to determine what the messages should be. We believe that we need to do our own research, and we're doing just that, just like we're doing our own assessment of the end-to-end test in Providence to determine exactly the changes we need to do. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We have a long, difficult road ahead, but we intend to do all we can to ensure that we carry out the most complete census possible in 2020 as defenders of democracy that we are. Thank you.